Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Today, we're going to cover the QQQ guidance for the week of November 23rd. For the sake of brevity, we're just going to call it the Qs as we go through this. So let's just jump into it. For November 23rd, we believe it's going to be bearish. Not a huge bear, just some slight pullback for the week of the 23rd. There's also 4 days of trading within the U.S. Thursday is Thanksgiving within the United States, so 1 day less of trading. Reason why we do feel that the fourth quarter is going to be a good growth for companies that are in the Qs. The challenge is macro conditions and the traditional December slowdown. For those that track stocks for a decade or so, traditionally there's a December pullback in stocks, and we expect that to continue this year as well. Also, the Qs are 4.5% from their all-time high, and there's a lot of resistance when it tries to break through that all-time high or 52-week high as well. So with this reasoning in mind, we believe it's going to be bearish. It's going to be a slight pullback, nothing major, not like a 5 to 10% correction. Although that's always possible. Again, everything that we presented to this is Prep to Grow's analysis of the data that's occurring in the market through our AI and big data platforms, as well as our guidance on what will happen. So with that, we believe it's going to be small bearish. Let's talk about some companies that are going to announce this week. So on November 24th, Tuesday of this week, Analog Devices will announce its Q4 and fiscal year end. We think that they are positioning well for fiscal year 2021, Q1, and the end of Q4. They started to ramp up significantly in levels that Prep to Grow hasn't seen since we started tracking them back in January of 2013. So we think they're setting up for the future. Some of the data points that you see here is that we think for their Q4, they had about a 1.1% growth. The analysts did not do any significant price adjustments to their targets, and so it was extremely flat. We did see a lot more volume increase. Just as a disclosure, Prep to Grow has been 83% correct in predicting Analog Devices stock prices and option prices. And that's an orange. We really feel that if it's greater than 90% or 95%, then it's a really good prediction. In this case, 83% is, take it with kind of the middle of the road recommendation. The other is that their stock increases actually dropped during their Q4, which would be unusual with the growth. However, it has been doing some ramping in Q4. And I think the analysts and the market's trying to price it into what they see as growth within them. But I think their general Q4 will be decent, but the only caution is the high growth at the end of the Q4, which means they're getting ready for growth in the fiscal year. And the other is if they were going to have a difficult fiscal year, typically you would see a company not set up for growth. They would wait and try to get expenses down and whatnot. So just a recommendation, they'll probably do pretty good in their Q4. Let's talk about Autodesk, again announced on Tuesday, November 24th. We see that they're going to grow nominal this quarter, not a lot, just a slight bump. We've been 81% accurate in our stock recommendations with them. So again, we like things over 90% accuracy. 9 out of 10 is really good for us. We see the analysts pull back in their pricing of them. We see their volume drop and their stock drop as well. We haven't seen any recovery of this within Q4. In fact, we've seen more drop. And typically what you see is in a pullback like this, it means one of two things. One, difficult quarter, need to get the expenses in alignment. They may have a layoff or they may do an acquisition. So we did see, and we did talk about an acquisition in last week's video on Autodesk specifically. They did make an acquisition last week of an AI company. And so they made some room from them, but this kind of drop in their expected growth coming out of Q3 and into Q4 is not a good forward-looking sign for Autodesk, even with an acquisition. So those are the two major ones that are announcing for the Qs this week. Combined, they don't even make up 1% of the total holdings for the Invesco Qs. So they do bad or great, it probably won't have much impact on the ramping of the Q for this week. Next week, there's really two big ones that are announcing: Zoom, everybody's favorites, especially at the stay-at-home stocks, and Synopsys. Both are kind of middle of the road in terms of performance and growth. And we'll talk more about them next week and what we expect their earnings should be. Let's talk about the companies with unusual option activity. So Adobe and Marriott. Marriott was another one that continues the trend from last week. Adobe, December and February for an expiration. It's a call, 48,490 strike price. The volume and interest ratio is 20, so that's good, very high. And somebody spent a ton of money on these guys, $8.5 million in cost, and this occurred on the 17th and 19th of last week. Marriott, there's been a lot of unusual activity on them for the last couple of weeks, specifically puts. April 16th expiration, 105 strike price, volume to open interest ratio is 10, and about 1.2 million trade costs. So over the last couple of weeks, talking 4 to 5 million. I mean, unusual option trading on them. People really buying into puts for Marriott, which makes sense with the current macroeconomic conditions. This occurred on November 17th. Let's jump into what our overall predictions are for the Qs. Historical stock prices. As we said, there was a slight pullback this week. Nothing too major. You still see a lot of volatility with the FAANG pluses. Just note that we separate FAANG plus from the other because the FAANG pluses make up about 64% of the total Qs holding. So if those 15 companies do something, it has much more broader impact on Qs. The rest of them, the 90 something of them or 80 something of them, don't have as much individual impact or group impacts. So FAANG pluses are the typicals, the Facebooks, the Amazon of the worlds. The others are the ones we talked about, the Autodesk analog devices. For the FAANG pluses, a lot more volatility throughout the year, some stabilization over the last couple of weeks, which has been great. In the non-FAANG pluses, pretty stable throughout, nice steady growth throughout the entire year. Stock volume, same thing. Stability finally for the FAANG pluses on the volume side. A little bit of dropping in the last week for both FAANG plus and other. That has a lot to do with going into December and November. Will we see a spike in December? Historically says no. So we should expect kind of a more leveling of the volume. However, macro conditions may change that. So just be aware of the macro conditions. 30-day long option volume. FAANGs are pretty steady, pretty even split between puts and calls. On the others, more puts than calls. Going into December, and these are long ones going into the next year, I don't necessarily buy into the premise of people buying long puts on the Qs right now, especially with the growth in our data that Prep to Grow is showing is that Q4 in 2021 is going to be a pretty banger year for them if macro conditions and other stabilize themselves. Year-to-date calls versus put predictions. And so this is ours and where we've seen things. It reflects the volume pretty much, although we do see more calls coming. We're predicting more calls versus puts. And that's predominantly at a exceptionally high level is the Q4 growth and the 2021 growth. So we'll probably start to see more of our predictions come out as calls. 30-day predicted bear versus bull. Again, in the short term, we see a bit of a bear. This is supported by our predictions. We have more puts in the short term options for a little bit of a pullback through puts, then a bull through stock recommendations and options. Just a note on our stocks, essentially, if we have recommendations that are for companies that have unfriendly options or those that have small volume and open interest, we'll recommend them as stock or predict that they may be a good stock buy. So, calls in stocks are essentially the equivalent of bull signals. Predicted stock price, pullback in the short term. more for all of them. For FAANG Plus and the other, again, a little bit of a short-term pullback, macro conditions, and the December slowdown of the primary drivers, probably for the algos predicting the pullback. That gets into our Qs. Just a note, a few people requested just kind of our methodology, so we'll provide our methodology slide. For the Qs, we've been tracking 94% of the fund, or we currently track 94% of the fund. We've started to track companies that have participated in the Qs since 2012, or collectively of them. We only track US or European companies that participate in the Qs, just because data outside of the US or European tends to get spotty or is hard to get accurate signals out of them. So we don't track non-US or European companies. Our predictions typically have a 1 to 90 day time horizons. Our average prediction time to hit is roughly 6 days. For short options, long options are a little bit longer, of course. We do not predict stocks. We do not predict option prices. We predict company performance, forward-looking performance, and short-term performance. And that invariably has an impact on stock and performance. But first and foremost, we predict company performance. We do this analysis through big data and AI technologies. To do the analysis, we collect millions of data points on a daily basis. They get analyzed, aggregated, signals come out of that around their performance, and if those signals have a prediction or has some correlation to stock price and option price, and we have an eye accuracy for that company in making predictions on their stock price and option movement related to that performance, then we may recommend it. Everything we talked about in this deck, we only look at companies where we have an 80+% accuracy on it. We like obviously a greater than 80%. We like 90% accuracy, but for the sake of having a bigger baseline to talk about, 80% is what we do. That is the Qs, and that's our methodology overview. If you have any questions, love to hear it. If not, I hope you have a fantastic week of trading. And for those in the US, happy Thanksgiving.